Forward TV. The world is thinking.
And of course, tonight's topic is Bigfoot and other wild men of the forest. We'll find out if there really could be a Bigfoot. It'd be kind of cool if there could. And with that, let's welcome our speaker, Genie Scott. She's a physical anthropologist and executive director of the National Center for Science Education. And as I mentioned, she's the president of the Bay Area Skeptics Board of Directors. So, Genie, on to you.
Onto the microphone. In case I'm not putting on makeup up here, but I was trying to figure out how maybe I could set up this little mirror so I could actually see what's going on behind me, because the way this works, I have no idea what's going on unless I'm doing this all the time, which is really, really boring for you to see me whirling around like a dervish here. The National Center for Science Education is a rather better-known organization than Bay Area Skeptics. NCSC is located in Oakland, and we deal with the controversial issue of the teaching of evolution in the public schools. We're for it. Alas, that is not a universally shared feeling in the United States, and so we do have our work cut out for us. However, although that is, in fact, my day job, I'm here today representing a smaller organization, the Bay Area Skeptics, which is a very old organization. In fact, it's even older than the National Center for Science Education. The Bay Area Skeptics began in the early 1980s, 1981, 1982, as a regional interest group of the, at that time, Buffalo-based Center for the Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, now the Center for Scientific Inquiry. The CSI group is the publisher of Skeptical Inquirer, and we at the Bay Area Skeptics look at ourselves not as being skeptics in the oh yeah kind of sense of denying everything, but as looking critically at claims of the paranormal, claims of healthcare, and claims of other scientifically related claims that in one or more ways don't exactly track what mainstream science would predict. Which doesn't mean that we deny that there are new discoveries to be made. Obviously, there are many new discoveries to be made in science. But there are many, many claims that are made in the name of science that do bear scrutiny. And what we try to encourage is an appreciation for science, which certainly is shared with the science cafes, and an appreciation of the importance of critical thinking as a way of making decisions about the natural world. So I'm here today as president of the Bay Area Skeptics, but also I guess I never can really take off my National Center for Science Education hat, because we also are concerned about science as a way of knowing and about critical thinking. But let's talk today about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, wild man of the woods. There's quite a few folk tales, myths, stories, accounts of the encounters of people with wild men of the forest. Sometimes these are hairy individuals, like on this slide here. Frequently they're giant individuals, much bigger than normal-sized human beings. And they vary in many respects as to whether they are benign or whether they are fierce. But they are stories of the wild men of the woods are found in Europe, they're found in North America, they are found in some places in South America, Africa, Asia, almost worldwide. Actually, yes, worldwide. They're also found in Australia, so I guess we hit all of the continents there. Lots of claims that these monstrous beings exist, and in general, claims of the nature of these wild men of the woods tend to fall into two camps. And from an anthropological or a folkloristic point of view, it's very interesting, these two really contrasting views of the wild men of the woods. One classification, one group of believers or proponents of the existence of these creatures looks at the Yeti, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, the wild men of the woods, as being an unknown or unexplained, undiscovered natural creature, an actual large mammal of some sort, generally a primate form. The second category, though, although in the second group of Bigfoot and Yeti believers, they do recognize that this is a large mammal of some sort, mystical characteristics are associated with these creatures. So they may have supernatural powers. They may be psychic. They may be able to shapeshift. In the United States, for example, where Bigfoot tends to be the most common term for these forms, although there are many regional forms. Many of the Bigfoot proponents will point to Native American tales of wild men of the woods in some fashion. And shape-shifting, shamanistic qualities, the ability to morph into some other creature or become invisible. These are all characteristics that some people associate with these wild men of the woods. It's kind of interesting, like I say, from an anthropological or a folkloristic point of view to kind of contemplate these two different approaches. And they tend to be rather different. If you go on the internet and you go to the Bigfoot sites, the Bigfoot proponents do tend to fall into one class or the other, although there's obviously some overlap. Nothing is ever all that crisply separated. But the Cryptozoology group, the group that believes that this is an actual flesh and blood creature and we can study it naturally, we can study it scientifically, and largely do not ascribe mystical powers or the ability to vanish or whatever. You still get some enthusiasms for the ability to cover its tracks, so you don't find remains of Bigfoots. They will carry their dead away. This is why you never find Bigfoot carcasses in the woods. Or they are able to conceal themselves in forests and woods, even though they're 10 and 12 feet tall. They can hide behind very thin trees, apparently, and avoid detection in that regard. But I've often kind of wondered whether these two reflections might reflect more of the human psyche, perhaps, than we really think. I'm thinking particularly about that second picture there on the right. That's a fairly menacing figure there, looming in the dark behind this peaceful group of campers who don't know what's about to hit them. You figure we are middle-class industrial society Americans. It is not part of our regular experience to worry about violent death at night in the dark. Okay, I don't know where you're walking around at night, but for most of us, this is not a real big worry. But you figure for most of human history, violent death in the dark was something that was quite likely. This is why you stayed in the cave at night. That's when the predators come out in the dusk and in the evening, and those are very dangerous times. So things that go bump in the night are something that shows up in folklore all around the planet and virtually all human cultures. And I wonder whether these ideas of scary or fierce or dangerous large human-like creatures that prowl the forests might be some kind of manifestation of this fear that is not totally unreasonable for most of human society. We tend not to think that way, living these very comfortable lives that we live today, and very much safer lives than our Pleistocene ancestors and even our early hunting-gatherer and early horticulturalist ancestors as well. Nonetheless, there certainly there is this class of Bigfoot supporters that believes in a mystical Bigfoot and a Bigfoot that can disappear or fly off in the night and so forth. That's fascinating from a folkloristic standpoint, but quite honestly, that's nothing that a scientist can deal with. If you are talking about a flesh and blood creature that has genes and passes on genes and takes in energy sources and excretes and behaves like a normal living creature, then we can talk. Then we can actually discuss the biology, the possible existence of these forms and so forth. If you believe in a shape-shifting monster or a supernatural creature, well, then that's a theological argument. That's nothing that a scientist is going to be able to debate with you unless you make some fact claims. And, when you think about that, that makes a lot of sense. Because what science is a way of explaining the natural world by testing explanations. And what makes science such a really nifty way of knowing is that we do test our explanations. We don't just go with the first kind of interesting idea that pops up. And when you think about how do you test an explanation, how do you really decide whether this explanation or that explanation is better, the way you test something scientifically is that you try to hold constant certain variables so that you can look to see whether the effect you're interested in actually works. If I've got 2 plots of corn, right, and I want to know whether putting fertilizer on one plot makes a difference in the yield, I can guarantee you that that will happen. All I have to do is not water the second plot, right? Not weed the second plot. There's lots of things that I can do to guarantee that the fertilized plot grows a higher yield. But you're not going to accept my conclusion that Scott Fertilizer here, there actually is a Scott Fertilizer, alas, it's not part of my family. You're not going to believe me when I say that the fertilizer is the reason why those crops in the first plot did so well. You're going to call me on that because I did not I did not hold constant things like how much water, how much sunshine, how much weeding. If I control for all of those things and the fertilized plot still does produce more yield, then I might be able to persuade you that fertilizing the field is a good idea. Okay? So to test an explanation, does the fertilizer make the crops grow better? I have to hold constant a number of other qualities in order to really support my explanation. If somebody is making a claim that Bigfoot can change its shape and disappear into, or turn into a bird and fly away when we're looking for it in the forest, you can't hold constant any variables with that. I mean, you basically have gone outside of what science can explain. What's interesting, though, is that most purveyors of the paranormal, whether it's Bigfoot or whether it's ESP or whether it's some quack medical claim, most purveyors of the paranormal are trying very hard to demonstrate the scientific veracity or at least corroborate their views using science. But they often don't do it right. There's a lot of semi-science out there. They're trying, but they don't quite understand enough about science to really control for variables, to hold constant variables like they should. And we'll see that, I think, as we talk a little bit about Bigfoot tonight. Well, certainly, so I'm going to talk about the cryptozoology component of the Bigfoot movement. We're not going to talk about the mystical movement. That's just outside of my job description here. Well, certainly there are lots of mysterious animals that have been proposed. Cryptozoology is basically the study of odd or unknown animals. This is the Fiji mermaid. Isn't this wonderful? This is a sideshow specimen that was exhibited in the 1800s and early 1900s. Obviously, it was some sort of monkey tied on to a fish body. There's lots of this fake lore, as it were, that's around. There are a lot of cryptozoological creatures like the Fiji mermaid that really are obvious hoaxes. They're efforts to try to produce creatures that never did live, and they are often produced for commercial reasons or whatever. But there are an awful lot of things which are sincerely believed as being unknown or odd creatures that need explanation. How many of you know what this is, just for fun? Okay, a couple of you, yeah. This, according to many internet sites, is a 20th century, basically 1960s, plesiosaur, found by a Japanese trawler. Now, plesiosaurs are dinosaurs, for crying out loud. They died out 60 plus million years ago. What is this anyway? Well, the story about the Japanese plesiosaur is a fascinating one, and if you just Google Japanese plesiosaur, it'll pop up. You'll get plenty of examples, as well as pictures that you can swipe from Google like I did. Now, this is a very interesting structure, isn't it? It's got this kind of long neck. You all know what a plesiosaur looks like? It's this, a fishy, or it's this reptilian quadruped. It's got a long neck, long tail, and so forth. The Japanese trawler fished this thing out of the water, and you can see that they've got it on a hoist. Well, it must have stunk pretty badly because they didn't keep it. They threw it overboard, and they did take a bunch of pictures of it, though. And of course, everybody in the cryptozoology community is saying, "Oh, how could you do this? This is this fabulous ancient source of mystery." And well, my hypothesis is that the reason why the Japanese fishermen hauled this thing out of the water, took one look, a good sniff, and dumped it back in the water again is because as fishermen, they were familiar with the appearance of a lot of things that you fish out of the water, including something like a basking shark. Now, a basking shark is a very large, it's actually a kind of whale. It's not actually a shark at all, but it's this large creature that tends to have, when it dies, it decomposes in kind of a characteristic way. The jaw falls off. It's got this kind of long upper jaw, which is what you're seeing here. It looks kind of like a carcass of a very strange animal that perhaps you've never seen before. But because we've seen these things decompose, we know what they look like before, during, and after, we can make a pretty good expectation that the so-called Japanese plesiosaur was really a basking shark. And the reason why the Japanese didn't keep it around is because they knew that it really wasn't anything terribly important. But just as an example of the kinds of cryptozoology that you're likely to encounter. Now, again, there are animals still being discovered. There aren't very many mammals still being discovered, and there definitely are not very many large mammals still being discovered. There was a kind of a medium-sized antelope discovered in Vietnam about a decade or so ago. There was an oxen-like animal also found in Southeast Asia. But these were discovered only in terms of Western science. The local people knew that they existed and even had some skins and even had some materials. So, the thing is, the world's pretty well explored by now. And if there are any really large mammals that aren't known yet, that we don't have remains of, that we don't have some sort of an understanding of, it would be pretty unusual. And of course, what the Bigfoot proponents and Wild Man of the Woods proponents are claiming is that there is an extraordinarily large creature out there that has somehow managed to avoid detection for a very long period of time. The Sasquatch or Bigfoot or Yetis are supposed to be in excess of 10 feet tall. I've even seen estimates of 12 or 13 feet tall, much bigger than an Alaskan brown bear, which is a pretty big mammal, considerably larger than a human, and even a gorilla, which is a creature that outweighs human beings. Gorillas can run 350 or 400 pounds. Most of us don't. So the question is, there are claims that are made that these large primates exist, that they have managed to live with human beings or in remote areas, undiscovered in the sense of not having left remains. We don't have these in our museums. We don't have pelts. We don't have skeletons. We just have some rather vague notions that these creatures are out there and exist. So the question is, how do we think scientifically about claims like this, about which we really can't say? I mean, one side says that these creatures exist, another side says, no, they don't exist at all. They might exist, they might not exist. How do you decide? And how are you going to use science to think critically about these cryptozoological claims? Well, if you're going to look at this scientifically, the first question you want to ask is, how does this information, that there's this new giant primate, undiscovered, etc., how does this information fit with what we already know from science? Well, right away, the size issue is pretty unusual. We do know from the study of mammals, primates, and other animals, that when you scale up a creature, you have to make changes in body proportions. Some of you are probably even as old as I am. Do you remember the movie Them, about the giant ants? Yeah, well, even younger people know Them, right? Okay, because it's been around. And there's something fishy about those giant ants. These ants were the size of this room, but they still had these spindly little legs. Doesn't work that way. If you have a creature the size of an elephant, it's going to have legs the diameter of an elephant, okay? Because that's just the way these sorts of size and scale things get along. So similarly, if you're going to have a 12-foot tall primate, the body proportions are going to have to be rather different from that of a human. They're going to have to be rather different from that of a gorilla. They're going to be different than anything we've seen. And most of the information out there on the wild man of the woods, the Sasquatch or Yeti, have them looking awfully human-like, just on a bigger scale. So, there's a number of things like that we'd want to consider. One thing you want to consider is, where do these creatures live? Well, they live all over the place. There's a Texas Bigfoot group, and they have marked where Bigfoot has been spotted, they claim, in Texas. You can find maps like this for virtually any state in the country. Bigfoot appears not just in the Pacific Northwest and in Northern California, which is where we're used to thinking about Bigfoot as Californians. They occur in Nebraska and in the Ozarks and in the Appalachians and in Texas, not too far from Austin, apparently, from the looks of this one map. If they live all over the place, does that make it less likely or more likely that they really exist? I would suggest that it probably makes it less likely, because if you're a very large mammal, you're probably going to be fairly specialized to not overly specialized, like a koala bear or something like that. But there's going to be a certain limitation to the kinds of environments that you can live in. One thing, consider a large-bodied primate like a gorilla. Now, gorillas live in a tropical environment. Some of the Bigfoot, some of the big guys live in tropical environments, but most of them are reported from temperate environments. And western Texas is not a tropical environment, okay? Gorillas live in tropical environments. They have to take in, given their body size, they have to take in something like 8,000 or 9,000 calories a day. They tend not to eat very calorie-rich food. A gorilla eats mostly leaves and shoots, the fruits when they can get it, nuts if they can get it, but they're mostly folivores. They're mostly leaf eaters, and a gorilla will spend something like half of his waking hours eating. You see the movies in National Geographic and so forth of gorillas. They got these big guts. Reason for that, because they have to keep eating almost constantly in order to get enough calories to keep that big bulk going. And the kind of food they tend to eat, leaves tend to be not very high calorie foods, and because that's the major component of their diet, they tend to really have to eat a whole lot. Okay, what is there to eat in western Texas that would be comparable to keep alive a really big mammal like that? Those are the kinds of questions you need to ask if you're going to look scientifically at Bigfoot. Because the first question you want to ask is, how do these observations fit with everything else we know from science? Okay. If we know from science that big-bodied primates have to eat a lot of food, then what does that tell you about the carrying capacity of the environment? You'd want to ask certain other things about Bigfoot or Yeti. You'd want to ask things like, what's the minimum population size that you would need in order to keep a gorilla size or larger than gorilla size population of organisms living for thousands and thousands of years? One of the real interesting, from a standpoint of a physical anthropologist, which is what I was when I was college professor, one of the really interesting explanations for where Bigfoot came from is that he's actually a remnant population of an Asian ape that's known from South Asia and southern China, called Gigantopithecus. Now, Gigantopithecus was a really big ape. It had a skull about the size of my laptop. I mean, this is really a big creature. It was estimated to probably be 8 or 9 feet tall, bigger than gorillas. We have skulls and we have teeth. We don't, last I looked, I don't think we have any postcranial, any material below the neck of Gigantopithecus, but we know that this was one really big ape. And the idea exists in the Bigfoot community that Yetis and big feet, one Bigfoot, several Bigfoots, okay, that Yeti and Bigfoots really are just descendants of these Gigantopithecus apes that managed to get themselves lost in some obscure corner of the world, like western Texas, I guess. Or, like the Pacific Northwest or the Himalayan mountains or something, and therefore have managed to survive undetected all these years. Well, what's the minimum population size that you would need in order to continue a population since certainly the Pleistocene, because the Gigantopithecus fossils date from the lower Pleistocene and from the late Pliocene. We're talking about 4 or 5 million years. Okay, now one of the things that we know from science, from looking at mammals, from looking at adaptations, is that if your population number goes too low, it's very easy for a species to wink out of existence. Because you do need a certain minimum population number in order to keep the genetic variation high enough to change, to adapt to changing environments and so forth and so on. It's one of the reasons why wildlife biologists are so concerned about cheetahs these days in Africa, because cheetahs went through this real genetic bottleneck, a real decline in population numbers, and so cheetahs are genetically very, very similar. Well, if you've got a population of these Bigfoot creatures or Yetis living up in the Himalayan mountains, it would seem that that would be a real population bottleneck. I mean, how could these populations survive over millions of years without being a fairly large number of people, large several population groups, in which case they would have been encountered by now. We should have some real physical remains of these forms. So from what we know of science, from what we know of the genetic needs, as it were, of large mammals, of the food needs of large mammals, the range and territory needs of large mammals, how much rainforest does it take to support a gorilla? Well, how much more Texas brush area, does it take to support a gorilla-sized primate? From all of these things that we know, it just seems really unlikely that there would be a 13-foot or so, or 10, 12-foot undiscovered population species of large primate. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just makes the probability much lower. But Carl Sagan once, who was a very famous critical thinker, Carl Sagan remarked a number of years ago that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you're going to make an extraordinary claim about a modern descendant of Gigantopithecus, that's pretty extraordinary. You better have some extraordinary evidence to support that. Let me talk a little bit about the evidence that is claimed for Yetis and Sasquatch, the wild men of the woods. We have footprints, sometimes handprints. There's even a body print, according to one source. There are sightings. People claim that they have seen the wild men of the woods. There are recordings of sounds that these creatures have allegedly made. And there are samples of things like hair, blood. There's even some DNA samples now, some hide. I haven't, except for some Yeti materials, I don't believe that there's any bones, say, of North American Bigfoot. But there are these various forms of evidence that have been claimed to support the idea that Bigfoot and Yeti really exist. Let's talk a little bit about the footprints. This is actually a cast of a Bigfoot print from Northern California. It's was given to the museum of the Phoebe Hearst Museum at the University of California, and I thank them for providing this really quite lovely photograph. This is another of their collection. I took this photograph. It's not nearly as nice as UC's. And, you know, there is some variation there. If you notice, the first one was considerably skinnier than the second one. Notice that the toes tend to be pretty well formed on these footprints, which actually makes me a little suspicious because most footprints tend not to be quite this pristine. The toe marks tend to be kind of mushed up. And notice also that this is a very flat-footed form. There really doesn't seem to be much of an arch. But maybe Bigfoot was a flatfoot. Maybe they didn't have arches. That's a possibility too. But then there's footprints that come from various places that really look quite odd. The kind of three-toed or whatever that is on the left is a claimed Bigfoot footprint from Louisiana. And the one on the one on the other side of the ruler is a more typical California one. Well, what exactly constitutes evidence for footprints? I mean, are these three-toed samples accurate? Are the other? I mean, there's an awful lot of stuff out there that is presented as being evidence for Bigfoot walking around. One of the most interesting ones is this one also from Northern California, the famous Cripplefoot, which was thought by the anthropologist Grover Krantz, who was a Bigfoot supporter. He believed in Bigfoot. I knew Grover. He was really an interesting guy, and I was very fond of him. Grover was convinced that the Cripplefoot could not possibly have been faked, that that the bones that would have formed the foot structure of this particular individual, you would have to be a skilled anatomist in order to fake this footprint. Some other critics of Bigfoot suggested that, well, perhaps it might not be that difficult. All you really need to do is get a photograph of a clubfoot. And clubfoot is an anomaly that occurs in some children. Fortunately, most of them can be operated upon and have this corrected. But there's, if you look in the medical books, you see lots of photographs that don't look much different from this, and just scale it up to 13 inches, and you'd get something that looks kind of like this. So, is this impossible to fake? Well, probably not. We do know, actually, that some of the footprints really are fake. There's no question about that. Roy Wallace was a road builder, construction manager in the Pacific Northwest, including Northern California. And he was a well-known prankster and apparently a man with a good sense of humor and had a lot of fun in life. And one of the things that he did, according to his family, Mr. Wallace died in 2002, and a reporter went to talk to his family, and the family said, yeah, it was really Roy, that he would carve these footprints, such as the one on the right there, and he'd go out into the woods, and he'd go out to road building sites, and he'd make a whole bunch of footprints around. And he would basically strap them. Here's his son holding one of the footprints, he would basically build these wooden Bigfoot feet, strap them on his own feet, and he was a pretty big guy. He was like, he's 6'3", 6'4". He was a pretty tall guy, so he could get a pretty good stride, and he'd just go out and make big footprints all over the place. And, but of course, the fact that some of the prints are fake doesn't mean all of them are fake, right? Okay. But it does illustrate the fact that it's possible to make fake prints. So one should think very critically, and one should carefully analyze each of these claims for a legitimate foot. Now, I would suggest that a useful way to think about the footprints, if you're going to try to look at this scientifically, is to look at footprints the same way that you look at UFOs. UFOs exist. There are unidentified flying objects. It happens to be the case that most things claimed to be UFOs end up being identified. And they tend to be airplanes, they tend to be stars, they tend to be reflections, they tend to be sort of weird atmospheric bounces of light and other kinds of visual phenomena. Most UFOs turn out to be IFOs, but some remain unidentified. There's no question about that. There are some weird phenomena in the sky that are unidentified. So what do you do with them? My nephew, unfortunately, is very, very quick to assume that if you haven't explained it, therefore, it is evidence for an extraterrestrial. Well, if you're going to think about this scientifically, one of the first phrases you learn as a scientist, and this is one way in which maybe we're a little weird compared to the general public, but one of the first things you learn as a scientist is the phrase, "I don't know yet." And if you have a UFO, if you have a truly unidentified flying object, as opposed to the identified flying objects, if you have a UFO, I would suggest that the proper response is, "We don't know yet," and just suspend judgment. If you have Bigfoot tracks, a lot of them you can dismiss pretty swiftly. They're in funny places. They don't work. They're one common source of Bigfoot tracks is bear tracks that are just merely eroded. If you can't explain a particular series of Bigfoot tracks, that doesn't mean that you jump to the conclusion that there are Bigfoot, Bigfoot, wild men of the woods. You don't jump to the conclusion that there's a real large 12-foot tall creature out there. The proper response is, we don't know yet. Because so many other observations of these big creatures don't really fit with everything else we know in science. And it would be very unusual if we would have to reject whole fields of science in order to explain one anomaly. It's much more reasonable to merely say, we don't know yet. Now, how are we doing on time? Okay. Yeah, why don't I stop right now? Because what I want to do after we have some questions in the second part is I want to show you some clips, show you some more of the evidence, and I would like us to talk a little bit more about, how do we make these decisions about how do we evaluate this evidence. Juliana.
Right. Any questions, comments? Here's one.
My question to you is this: does the orangutan exist? In some sense it does. We can go to the zoo and see it. But the orangutan first existed in the West as a rumor of some kind of primitive, intelligent creature living out in the jungles of Sumatra and Borneo. And the very
gorillas too.
And indeed, and the very first observation of the word orangutan was first used by a Dutch explorer who described seeing a hairy female who wore clothing, lived in a hut, did her cooking, and so forth. This does not correspond to what we call orangutan. Nevertheless, there does exist a kind of primate called an orangutan.
Yeah, I think the point needs to be made, and I will certainly repeat it, that there may be undiscovered creatures. Orangutans, gorillas were really not known until the 1800s. In fact, Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's great associate and Darwin's bulldog, was one of the first Europeans to actually dissect a gorilla. The gorilla was thought to be a mythical beast as well. So even as recently as 200 years ago, we were discovering large creatures. But I guess what we have to think about is, what's happened lately. That was 200 years ago. A lot less was known about the world. Okay. Wait until Juliana, because this is being
I was
taped.
trying to make, by the original definition of the word orangutan, it does not exist. The
Okay.
original understanding was indeed this sort of fairly intelligent primitive creature. Similarly, it is possible that by the original definition of the word Bigfoot, it does not exist. Nevertheless, there might exist, shall we say, a chimp escaped from a linguistics experiment, which does exist, which possibly somebody might have been mistaken for a Bigfoot and might, indeed the word Bigfoot conceivably in the future might be applied to such a creature.
Possibly. But I think what we have, if we just look at Bigfoot in the United States, North America, I should say, because it's spotted in Canada and the United States as well, there tends to be a real sameness of the characteristics ascribed to this creature. It is always very large, it is very hairy, it tends to be this dark fur, reddish fur, dark brown fur. Lots and lots of very similar characteristics are ascribed to this creature. Similarly, by the way, if you ask UFO fans what does an extraterrestrial look like, it's always the big almond-shaped eyes and the big head. There's a sameness to the description. That doesn't necessarily mean that there are UFOs or that, there are ETs or that they look like that. The fact that there's a commonality of description of Bigfoot doesn't necessarily mean that there is a creature like that. This gets us into the realm of folklore as well. And we will tend to see things that we expect to see. I was reading online, and I wish I had taken some notes on this because it was such an interesting example. But in one of the Dutch museums, a red panda, the red pandas, it's related to raccoons. It's if this was if I had a red panda on this table, it would stand about so tall at the shoulders, and it's actually capable of sort of standing up, and looking around a little bit like this. But it's not really a biped. But it's this little cute animal. It's sort of reddish, and one of them escaped from the zoo in one of the Dutch cities. And so they put out an all-points bulletin about how there's this red panda that's been lost. Here's what it looks like. If you see it, please report it. There were 300 sightings of this creature within the next couple of hours. Now, there's no way that this creature could have been in so many different parts of the city. And believe me, this is not the native area of red pandas. There's only one red panda in that entire city, believe me. But we tend to see what we want to see, and I think a lot of these Bigfoot impressions tend to be people who really would like this creature to be real. I'd like it to be real, and there's an expectation, and it goes on from there. We might find that Bigfoot is an actual creature that was just misunderstood, like the orangutan was, but the sameness of the description would argue against an escaped chimpanzee in the Northwest, say, because then why is the same description coming up in Florida? So anyway.
Yes, I just want you to know I don't believe in Bigfoot unless there's actually concrete evidence. But my thing is, like you said, 200 years ago, the world was different. First, especially in North America, we've knocked down a lot of trees and forests. We built a lot of property, and like a lot of animals move. Eventually, we're going to change the earth so much that Bigfoot's going to have no place to hide. So if it does exist, that'd be one way to find it.
Yeah, I suppose in one sense, if once we pave paradise, we'll find out all sorts of creatures that we didn't know about before. But let's hope that we don't have to get to that state.
Genie, how far back do Bigfoot sightings go?
Well, it sort of depends on where you want to start. Bigfoot in North America goes back to the 1950s. It's not a terribly old phenomenon. And it's interesting. I mentioned fake lore. Fake lore is where you make up folklore, like Pecos Bill or Paul Bunyan. And a lot of fake lore is developed for commercial purposes, so to speak, to bring tourists to the Ozarks to see, whatever the, Pecos Bill in Texas, for example. There could certainly have been elements of this in the origin of the Bigfoot story in Northern California and the Pacific Northwest. And these were also ascribed to Native American tales. The term Sasquatch is actually a Salish Indian term for wild man. Now, of course, the Indians of the Northwest Coast and California did not have written language. It was oral traditions only, and oral traditions are very fluid. We know this from folklore studies. We know when a particular origin myth, say, is collected in the 1840s from Plains Indians, and then you go back 75 years later and collect the same story. It's all of a sudden picked up all of these Christian characteristics because the missionaries were there, and you get syncretisms of views. Well, the same thing, of course, was happening even before white people got to the North America, because the Indians themselves would swap. So folklore evolves, and so. The idea of wild men of the woods, as I started out, is probably a very old folktale that is found all over the world. Sasquatch might have been the Salish version of it, but somehow Sasquatch kind of got folded into some of these other, quite possibly fake lore ideas. Somebody else have a...
Yeah, hi, thanks for speaking tonight. I'm just curious what percentage you personally think Bigfoot exists? How sure are you, percentage-wise?
Less than 5%. But that's because I'm an optimist.
Were you asking the audience? Or were you asking for... Oh, okay.
I mean, how could I have run NCSE for 20 years if I wasn't an optimist? Yes, sir.
Hi. Someone left me with this question, which seemed to be very pressing to them, so I'll read it to you. Have you read Robert Michael Pyle's book about his 2-month walk through Bigfoot country called The Dark Divide, and what do you think of it?
I'm sorry to say that I have not read that book, and but I will commend you to a wide variety of Bigfoot books. I mean, there's just a ton of books out there. I would say the best one from a scientific stand book is Jeff Meldrum's book called, Pardon me? Thank you very much. Legend Meets Science. Jeff Meldrum is a physical anthropologist. He believes Bigfoot is real. But he is a critical thinker. He's trying very hard to test the ideas that, the footprints, analyze, and so forth. I don't think he's always comes up with the right solution, but he's trying. He's headed in the right direction. As far as proponent books, I think that is very likely. And just in the same spirit as that fellow who left the question with you, I got an email shortly after this Ask a Scientist event was advertised from somebody from Virginia. And he says, since I cannot attend the Ask a Scientist lecture with Dr. Scott in January, my question to her is, I, along with 3 law enforcement agents, witnessed a Bigfoot creature from 75 feet away in 1995. It was not a man in a suit or a bear. All agreed that it was a Bigfoot creature. The sighting lasted 12 seconds. My question is, what do you think we saw? And I'm not, I didn't, you chuckled, but I didn't present that as something that we should laugh at. I think people have very meaningful experiences, particularly when you're out in the woods and it's different and it's dark and stormy and whatever. A lot of the times the Bigfoot observations are made in dark kinds of situations or very dim light or from very far away. it's very easy to mistake your own your own eyes. And in fact, that might be a nice segue to the next point that I wanted to make. Or did you want to ask some more questions?
Let's take one more question
Okay.
before the break, and then I've already got the question asker in mind. But save your questions. There'll be another Q&A period after the break. So here is our last question.
My name is Brandon Kyle, and I'm a field investigator with the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. And I just have a couple of quick things that I wanted to kind of clear up. You said that there aren't any really solid sightings that go back further than the 1950s, and that's not true. We have sightings that are on our database that include newspaper reports that go back to the 1700s of people seeing large apes that they can't explain, or things that are stealing things from their farm, from their apple orchards, that type of thing. And we have information on our website that can fill in those holes completely. We take over 400 reports a year from people who are seeing these animals, in addition to hearing these animals. That's not including the ones who are hearing them. We have sighting reports. We have audio recordings of these animals. What do you think this is? Do you think this is just like a mass delusion that people are having, and that's why we're getting so many reports? Or do you think that people are just kind of feeding into one another and not really sure exactly what they're seeing?
No, I don't think it's mass delusions. I really don't. I think that there are a lot of things. Well, it's sort of like the UFO example. There's a lot of things that are seen. Some of them we can explain. You know yourself. Some of them are fakes. Some of them are missightings of bears or other sort of large mammals. Sometimes it's people who steal your chickens. I mean, you know, there's lots of bipeds out there who could be doing you harm. There is a residue, like I said. There's a residue of cases that we have not explained. I have a feeling that you and your associates are more likely than I am to give credence to those as yet unexplained examples. The critics of the wild men of Bigfoots and Yetis accept a different canon, as it were, of unexplained ones. Many of the ones that the proponents accept as unexplained, many of the critics think have been explained. I'm sure this discussion will go on for a long time. Why don't you tell them your website again so that if anybody wants to find out more of this information?
It's the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organizations. We're at bfro.net.
bfro.net.
And one thing, Dr. Jeff Meldrum's book is a fantastic book to start. It's an amazing amount of information. He's an extremely critical individual. I've worked with Jeff for a long time and have, on a fairly regular basis, we get casts, track samples and stuff that we submit to him, and probably maybe one out of every 20 or so he actually takes seriously. So, I mean, his book is a fantastic place to start.
Yeah, we both agree.
It's not overly scientific. It's a very good read. And another one that you're kind of dealing with, that you're talking about American Indians and Native American stories and things. Kathy Moskowitz-Strang came out with a great book last year that's really, really interesting, that kind of compiles, is wonderfully illustrated, and deals with a lot of the stories, including pictographs and rock drawings of these animals that have gone back for several hundred years. So,
well, I'm not denigrating the proponents. Like I say, I think it's a very small probability that these creatures exist. And the main reason why I would say that is because if these creatures exist, an awful lot of what we know from other basic sciences has got to be seriously wrong. And I think, given the probabilities, I know which side I'd come down on. But I guess we have a break now?
Yeah, let's take a quick break, about 10 minutes, and then stick around and we'll keep talking about Bigfoot.
Some people came up during the break, and we were talking about sightings of Bigfoot. And certainly, you know, people can report that they have seen very dramatic things, and, you know, they need to be analyzed. Many things you can explain by indistinct forms, lighting is bad or whatever. But I want to also throw out the idea that eyewitness reports are actually a very inexact form of data. We tend to think that eyewitness reports are really reliable, and if somebody saw the murder being committed, then they're, therefore Miss Scarlet with the lead pipe and the, whatever, you got them and everything. But actually, the reason why eyewitness reports are not considered adequate for criminal cases is because we tend to be very poor observers. We tend to be very poor observers. We also tend to see what we want to see. We tend to focus on certain things and ignore other things. And our memories tend to conflate events. That's only a very, very short list of problems with eyewitness testimony. But I thought I would provide something kind of fun. I hope that this turns out pretty well. I've never really done very much when it comes to embedding videos in PowerPoint, so please bear with me if this does not go well. Let's talk a little bit about the sightings as evidence for Bigfoots and Yetis. But let's do a little exercise first. This is a fun little clip from the BBC, actually, and let's see if I can get this to work.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
Don't you just love the BBC? I mean, that's a PSA. That's the greatest PSA I think of. But point being, that was really fun, wasn't it? I mean, I noticed when I watched that. Well, actually, what about you? Did any of you notice anything? I noticed that the bear had turned into a suit of armor, but the other 20 things certainly, went by me very quickly. We tend not to focus on things we're not focusing on, so to speak. We tend to miss a lot of details. I'm going to now demonstrate I am the bravest person in this room because I'm going to show you a video clip from 1997 of me. And I look a lot younger back then. This is a clip from a movie that was made by the History Channel about the abominable snowman. And I'm going to show you some more clips from this. But this first was sort of the introductory setup clip. These movies are all alike. All of these, they get one scientist, right? And then the whole rest of the movie is woo. Right. And the one scientist and Dr. Scott and somebody really boring, what do you have to say about this? And that's sort of the job that you have when you're on these shows. So anyway, this is me in a long time ago, but we are talking about the sightings, shall we say.
The biggest reason why most scientists are skeptical of there actually being a Yeti is that there really isn't any evidence for it. There have been a lot of sightings, reports of sightings of large creatures up in the mountains in, say, the Himalayas, or even in North America with the Bigfoot. There have also been a lot of sightings of Elvis.
But even if the Yeti is only legend, there have been persistent sightings of this creature throughout history. Similar stories of Yeti-like creatures are reported from around the world. Perhaps the most famous is Bigfoot, or Sasquatch, of North America's Pacific Northwest. In the Amazon, an enormous ape-like creature called the Mono Grande is said to haunt the far reaches of the rainforest.
It's a monkey.
In the snowy vastness of Siberia, nomadic herdsmen tell tales of the mysterious almas, which leaves behind only huge footprints. The stories of hair-covered man-like creatures have been told throughout history.
Okay. Let's take a look at one of the most important Bigfoot sightings, that of the Bluff Creek area in Northern California. Not too far from where we are, but it's a pretty rugged area, certainly. At the time that this event took place, there was a lot of road work going on. Road building crews were building roads into area for logging purposes. And Roger Patterson, the fellow who I showed you earlier holding up the fake foot, Roger Patterson was the, I'm sorry, excuse me, not Patterson, sorry. Genie. Roy Wallace, I'm sorry. Roy Wallace was the supervisor on that road crew. Roy Wallace is the one who had the fake feet, who later on admitted that he had made a lot of fake feet. And he later related that as a joke, he had made a whole bunch of Bigfoot feet around the soft dirt of the road crew area and around the trucks and the other earth-moving equipment, just as a joke to kind of freak out some of the guys who were working. He was a practical joker, everybody admits that. And Roger Patterson and Robert Gimlin were two Bigfoot hunters who, Patterson had written a book about Bigfoot. They really believed that Bigfoot was in this area. And given these reports of large footprints, they went out to search the Bluff Creek area to see what they could find. It happens to be the case that Roy Wallace told them where to look, which in hindsight certainly does look rather suspicious. The Patterson video is considered a very, very important video by Bigfoot proponents and has been largely rejected, if not entirely rejected, by Bigfoot skeptics. And I'm afraid we'll have to take a slight, because I don't think this is going to work. Yeah, it didn't work before. It's not going to work now. Hang on, I will play you that video in another format. Now, this is a very jerky handheld camera. The guy's getting off his horse. He's looking through the woods. He's spotted this large creature. There it is. Can you see him walking well? Okay. And watch, it turns around and looks back. We'll get back to that a little bit later. Swinging the arms, a wide stride, 1967. And then more jerky camera angles. If you look carefully, you can see it way, way in back. There isn't a sound with this. There he is again. I'm sorry this doesn't project terribly well. There's a number of copies of this on the internet if you want to try to look at projecting on PowerPoint is not the best thing in the world here. So this is considered by at least the Bigfoot proponents whose materials I've read, is considered a very reliable, very good evidence. They're way out in the middle of no place. They see this very large creature who walks bipedally. A number of claims have been made about this creature. It's people have claimed to see critics have claimed to see a zipper running down the back. I certainly cannot see anything like that. Proponents have claimed to see muscles underneath the hide. I have a tough time seeing that. There are efforts made to zoom in to the footage there, to blow it up. In the best of circumstances, even with modern techniques of trying to improve the quality of the images, it still looks an awful lot like a blurry picture walking around. Let me show you another Patterson clip, and this one where they have zoomed in. And that one portion of the tape that I showed you where the creature turns and looks over its neck at the two men, Patterson, Gimlin, and then walks away, that is repeated a couple of times. So give me just a moment to pull that up. Okay, I don't see a zipper. I also don't see muscles. Some people do. Maybe I'm just not good enough. People have claimed to have seen the color of his eyes. That seems a stretch to me. Now here's the point where he turns around and looks over his shoulder. It's a female, by the way. You can see that there's, they're running the tape back, so it's not walking backwards, really. You can see some pendulous breasts in the front of the creature. This gets repeated a couple of times so you can see it. There's kind of a bunchiness around the rear end there. Now, my skeptical eye kind of tends to look at that as he put on the suit over his pants, but, maybe that's because I'm not. Now, to someone like me, this looks a lot like a person in a gorilla suit, but people who claim that this is very, very persuasive information. The size estimates for the Patterson, Gimlin, Bigfoot range considerably. Patterson thought that, and some of the proponents believe that it is, 6 foot 6 inches tall or taller. Others think that it's really maybe someplace between 6 feet and 6'6". It's very difficult. There was one estimate that was attempted where they had the footage and they went back to the spot, and a person who was about 6 feet tall walked in the same pathway, and they tried to make measurements, knee to knee and shoulder to shoulder, and try to get an estimate. Problems with those kinds of estimates is that the camera angle was not very reliable. And if you're going to try to make an estimate for how big something is, if I was taking a picture of the man in the middle back there and pointing a camera at him and estimating his stature by the man sitting next to him, they would both have to be in the same plane, and they'd both have to be in the same plane of the camera. And that's not really the case with the Patterson film. By the way, the nickname is Patty, which I like. I think that's nice. Well, there's not just the Patterson videotape. There also are videotapes of Yeti, and from that same video that I showed you before is something called the Snowwalker Yeti. Now, this was an interesting story. When they were making this videotape back in the late 90s, I was sent a videotape which purported to be a Belgian couple that were on a winter camping trip in the Himalayas. And they were speaking Flemish or something, I guess. And they had all their equipment, and you never really saw their faces. You know, they always were sort of underneath these big, heavy parkas and coats, or, you know, they never really showed it. They weren't revealing who they were. This was a big mystery. But they had videotape of an alleged Yeti. And the makers of the video sent this tape to me, asked me to look at it, and then comment on it on their program. What happens is the couple is, you know, walking through this very deep snow. It's about thigh-deep snow. And they're walking up a hill, and then they turn around, and it's actually the wife, is shooting down past the husband, and there's this creature down there on the path. And the creature gets up and walks away. So let's take a look at the Snowwalker, as it's called. She says, hopefully. I think what I have to do is this first.
While climbing a hill, the cameraman turns back to shoot the couple's own footprints in the snow. Suddenly, the camera captures a strange figure.
See it right there? Notice that it's getting up.
Of course, this film has no context whatsoever. You don't know who made it, you don't know where it was shot, you don't know when it was shot. So basically, this is not evidence, unless you can actually track down the source and ask these people some serious questions.
Now, this was supposedly filmed in the Himalayas. We don't know the identity of the filmmakers. One of the arguments verifying that this was not a hoax that the filmmakers pointed out to me is that the equipment that they were using was European. I said, have you ever been to REI? The fact that they used European camping equipment doesn't really it doesn't really validate that they are European. And I said, they claim to be Belgian. Did you get a native Flemish or Walloon speaker to listen to, are they really native? There's a lot of things that you could do to check the veracity of this statement.
The videotape seems highly suspect. The couple who taped this purported Yeti encounter have refused to reveal their identities publicly. The source of the tape, and indeed the actual location of the encounter, remain unrevealed.
The simple explanation for this tape would be the couple and their friend in the gorilla suit came up the trail, walked up the hill. He sat down there next to the trail, waited for him. The folks got halfway up the hill, turned around, turned on the camera and said, "Okay, Fred, time to walk." And the guy in the gorilla suit gets up and he starts walking away and floundering through the snow.
And boy, he's really floundering too. Look at him. If this was a creature who lived in this environment all of its life, it's not going to pass on its genes. You would think it would be a little more competent about getting around in the zoo. Well, as it turns out, this is a hoax. This was an admitted hoax. It was, I wasn't able to exactly get all of the information. Some attribute it to Fox News. I think probably Fox bought it from the couple instead. But you know, neither proponents nor skeptics of the Yeti accept the Snowwalker video as an actual true sighting of a Yeti or filming of a Yeti. But it does illustrate a number of the things that you'd want to ask about. You know, what size population would you need? 50 individuals, 100 individuals, 200 individuals, 1,000 individuals? What size population would you need to maintain a large-bodied primate like this for millions of years in a very difficult environment? What are these creatures eating if they have to get 9,000 calories a day and there's nothing but snow from pillar to post? I heard that this was actually filmed in Switzerland. I heard that it was filmed near Mammoth Mountain. It's shot very cleverly so that you don't really get any natural features in there. You just see a lot of snow, you see a lot of rocks. You don't even see any vegetation that you can put your finger on. You can't say, aha, that's, you know, eastern slope of the Sierra vegetation. You can't even say. So it's cleverly done in one sense. But of course, the fact that the couple refused to come clean and didn't really have a very good story, I think also makes you rather suspicious on that part as well. Now, another suggestion that I want to make in terms of the sightings of Bigfoot and why I and many others are skeptical about the likelihood that there really is a very large primate out there that hasn't been discovered yet, is that for many years, wildlife biologists have been studying a variety of animals, variety of mammals and birds, by the setting up of what they call camera traps. This is a study done by a guy up at UC Berkeley and some people at Humboldt State, where they set up what they call camera traps, which is a network of cameras across the Sierras, which basically are just set to run, and anything that walks by triggers the shutter, and you get a picture of it. Now, these guys were studying martens, which is a small mammal, and they were able to do a lot of good wildlife biology and mapping the distribution of martens, getting a little bit of an idea of age and sex and size and so forth and so on. This is done not uncommonly with animals. This is another study that was done not on martens, but let's see, what was this again? I forget. Fishers, which is another weasel, a member of the weasel family. And notice that these camera traps are set up in areas where Bigfoot has claimed to have been found. Now, the thing is, wildlife biologists have been doing this for decades. The camera equipment's getting better and better. There's some very good data that are being collected on lots of animals. You also have wildlife biologists, especially ornithologists, who are actually in the field a lot. And as my colleague Josh Rosenau, who is actually a wildlife biologist, was telling me, some of these ornithologists are really, really good at spotting really small animals at long distances. You know, they can pick out a chickadee at 100 yards, 200 yards. But somehow they never really see a 12-foot tall primate. And if they were out there, you'd think that it'd be a little easier to see them, and it would be easier to take their pictures. That doesn't mean they're not out there. But again, this is, if they were there, the probability is such that sooner or later one of these camera traps would fix them. Now, the particular school of Bigfoot proponent that it belongs to sort of the mystical school will say, well, they're smart enough to know where the traps are and they avoid the traps, or they turn into birds and fly away or something, but, those really are not very credible arguments. Plenty of other smart animals like bears, coyotes, get their picture taken all the time. And in some cases, these cameras are infrared, so there's not even a flash. I mean, you don't even know the camera's there. So, the existence of camera traps and wildlife biology studies throughout the areas where Bigfoot allegedly lives does, again, question the conclusion that there really are these creatures. Well, now the last category of evidence that I want to mention is this idea of samples. One of the questions that came up during the break, a couple of people were up chatting, they were saying, has there ever been a Bigfoot skeleton found? Well, no, and that's the problem. If you've got a population of probably several hundred or a couple thousand of these Bigfoots living in the Pacific Northwest, you would think sooner or later one of them would die in a manner or get hit by the car on a highway or something, that we would actually have some physical remains. What tends to be the case is that people will, for example, in a case not too long ago in Ontario, Canada, where some boatmen on a river heard a lot of very loud crashing and saw a very large dark shape on the riverbank, and then went, in the morning when it was not quite as frightening to go out, they docked the boat took a little skiff to shore and went out and looked around, and they found trampled areas, and they found tufts of reddish hair, which they collected. And they sent these tufts of hair to a genetics lab, a biology lab at one of the Canadian universities. And the Canadians did some, I'm sorry, this is the wrong study. Oops, that's the second one I'm going to show you, alas. What they, this is, sorry about that. I will tell you about the Canadian one in a moment, but this is another, my slides were out of order. This is a slide where a similar kind of comparison was made with what was claimed to be hair from a Yeti in Asia. And when the analysis was done, it found that the swatch of hair actually was very, very similar to that of a horse. In fact, the vast majority of samples of hair or of blood turn out not to be something odd, turn out to be very similar to something that's already known, such as a horse, or in the case of the Ontario hare, it turns out to cluster very, very closely with bison. So very likely what it was a bison was on the shore there in Ontario, and some hair came off, the hair was analyzed, and that's the closest thing. Some of the abominable snowman or Yeti hair is actually yak hair or bear hair. There are some, several actually, analyses of hair which do not, when the analyses were done, these analyses did not show affinity with any known animal. Now, does that mean that we should think that maybe these hair samples that don't cluster with any known animal, at least at the time that the analyses were done, does that, increase the probability that these belong to a Yeti or an unknown creature, a Bigfoot? Well, not necessarily. We have techniques of genetic analysis that are much better, and we can compare the samples that exist, if they are of proper quality, to genetic sequences of a much greater range than was the case, say, 5 or 10, even as recently as 5 or 10 years ago. So perhaps some of these samples that currently are unclassified might actually belong to known animals. But like I said before, there are UFOs, there are unexplained phenomena there. There are footprints, there are hair samples that are unexplained. Does that necessarily mean that Bigfoot exists, or Do you take the attitude that I think most scientists would say, that we don't know yet? And like I say, either Bigfoot exists or we have to throw out an awful lot of our knowledge of natural history. I'm going to leave with one last thought, and then we'll have a discussion. And this is a clip from that movie
Oh,
again.
I hope there's a Yeti. I don't know a scientist in the country who wouldn't be excited by the idea of a strange primate that's unknown, of ancient races of mankind, perhaps in mysterious places. The problem is, I and most of the other scientists I know would really rather know than believe. And when you look at all of the evidence, it's pretty unconvincing, unfortunately.
Thank you very much.